Thank you, Karen. Just the other week, we actually on the 15th, our sixth was born, and we brought him home on. He was born on a Friday. We brought him home on a Saturday. Unfortunately, numbers 4 and 5, that's Catherine and Peter, began to have this hacking cough, and by Sunday they were having a low-grade fever. We had to take the baby to the doctor that Sunday. That was the Sunday that I was out for a weight check. And we took the other two as well just to make sure they didn't have the flu. Thankfully, they didn't. And as the week continued to unfold, though, Catherine was getting better, but Peter was continuing to get sick and seemingly maybe even get a little sicker. By Thursday of that week, though, I wound up taking him to the pediatrician's office, and thankfully it still wasn't the flu, but he did have a raging ear infection in one ear and a growing ear infection in the other. So what they prescribed is an antibiotic. Peter is 3 years old, and I don't know if you're aware of this or if you've forgotten about it or haven't given much thought to it, but if you give a 3-year-old an antibiotic, you're not going to give them a pill because they can be a pill, but they don't like to take pills. And so the pharmacy will fill that in a liquid format. And most of the time what they do is, because most medicines don't taste very good, they put some sort of flavoring in there to make them more palatable. On this particular day, when I picked up the prescription, though, it didn't occur to me to even say something about that, to even ask about any flavoring. And I get the medicine home, I get Peter into the kitchen, and you draw it up in a syringe, and I give him the 5 milliliters. When it goes into his mouth, immediately he's making this sour face, and I thought, oh, probably should have said something about the flavoring. And I can tell he's getting ready to spit this out. But we can't. He needs this medicine. And so at that point, I cover his mouth and I pinch his nose. It was in Jesus' name. So that, and I said, Peter, you have to swallow this. And at that point, he really has no choice. But clearly the look on his face is that this is just terrible. And he's supposed to take this twice a day for 10 days. I thought, well, this is number one. How in the world am I going to get 19 more doses into this little guy's mouth? And so I don't know what I'm going to do. When it came time that evening to give him this, I thought, well, this joker's a fighter, and he may win on some of these things. What can I do? And so at that point, because the good thing, I guess if it was a good thing, is that his ears were hurting. And so I would say to him, Peter, this medicine will make your ears not hurt. And so that pain you're feeling inside, it'll go away. And if you take it, I'll give you a cookie. Do you want a cookie? Uh-huh. Okay. So every time from that point on, when he would take a dose of this medicine, in fact, I would say to him, hey, Peter, let's go get your medicine. And there would be this look on his face, but I'd say, this will help your ears, and don't you want a cookie? And so he, even reluctantly, he would come in there and get his medicine. When I was doing that, when I was giving to him and reminding him that he would get a cookie, and every time telling him this is making him better, this is for his good, what am I doing? I'm accentuating the positive. Consistently and regularly we do that in life, don't we? Some of you in terms of your work schedule, maybe even someone asked you about it this week or even this morning. They asked you about what kind of hours you work, and it may be that you say, hey, I work 12-hour days. And they would say, oh, that stinks. But you would say, well, I'm able to work 3 12s and then I get 4 days off. So what do? You're accentuating the positive. Regularly we do that. We take something that otherwise may be or have some unpleasantness or something about it that we don't like, but then we look at the flip side, the benefits, the positives that come our way because of it, and it makes it easier to deal with. This morning we're going to be finishing a series that I started a number of weeks ago called In the First Degree. And the premise of this series has been pretty simple, that if you are someone who is actually a follower of Jesus, not only can it be this way, it should be that you are living in intentionally Christian ways. So that it's not merely where you spend your time on a Sunday morning, but what your life looks like on a Tuesday afternoon, a Thursday morning, or a Saturday night. That if anyone's paying attention to you, it should be fairly unmistakable. Hey, this is somebody that's trying to live like they're one of those followers of Jesus. Not to say that you're doing everything perfectly, but you're trying to live intentionally like Jesus, trying to live intentionally as one of his followers. So that being said, let me ask you this question. What is one way, and we've been talking over the past week, ways that we can do and we can live intentionally Christian, but what's a surefire way that you can live intentionally in unchristian ways? I mean, what is it that you can do that guarantees that your life at any given moment will look like you're not a follower of Jesus? Well, you don't have to think very long and hard about that. What it would take is for you to do things that God has said not to do. I mean, that God has given standards, that God has given laws, that God has given rules, and God has said, these are the boundaries that you're supposed to operate in between, these boundaries. And so when we choose not to do that, when we choose to violate his rules, well, at any given moment, we're absolutely not living in an intentionally Christian way. Why? Because we're violating those rules. But that's the rub for us, isn't it? That's the difficulty. Because you're aware of this, God has a lot of rules, doesn't he? He really does. I mean, the Bible that's hopefully in your lap at this point, there's a lot of thou shalts and a lot of thou shalt nots in there. And we don't need to apologize for that. God has given us a lot of ways in which that he wants us to operate. But regularly we find ourselves violating those rules. But let me ask you this, why do we regularly violate those rules? It's pretty simple. Because we want to do something different. Because whatever it is that God has said, we don't want to do that. God has said, do X. Well, I would rather not do X. I want to do Y because I think Y is more fun. I think Y would feel good at this moment. Y is what I want to do. This is what I want to say. So we keep living in unchristian ways because we don't do what God has said. We so often are living in unchristian ways because God's laws, God's rules, so many times we just don't want to do them. Well, how is it that we can get to the point where God's laws are the very things that we want to do? I think it can come when we begin to accentuate and focus on the positives of God's laws. But what exactly are those? Look with me in your Bibles today to Psalm 119. Psalm 119. We'll be working our way through the entirety of this psalm this morning. No, that's Psalm 119. We're going to start with verse 97. In case you're unaware of this, Psalm 119 is the longest psalm in the Bible. And if you've already found it, we're going to be dropping in at verse 97. If you look above that, you will see a word that you probably don't understand and a little squiggly character that you can't identify. In fact, if you go back to the beginning of this psalm, you'll start to see there's a whole stack of those. There's Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. What are those? Those are all Hebrew letters. Psalm 119 is not only the longest psalm in the Bible, the longest chapter in the Bible, it's also a gigantic acrostic. In fact, if you go back to verse 1 of Psalm 119, you see the Hebrew character Aleph. Each of those sections begins with the Hebrew letter that you see listed there. So if you've ever looked at Psalm 119 and thought, I wonder what that is, well, that's exactly what it's doing. But even though each of these sections begins with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, there is a unifying theme throughout this very lengthy psalm. And it is the psalmist extolling the virtue of and talking about the goodness of God's laws, the goodness of God's rules. Now, doesn't that sound kind of strange? I mean, how many of you have ever played a game, like if you were first introduced to baseball or first introduced to basketball, and you're like, man, I love this game because the rules are so good. Man, love Uno. How if you don't say Uno, I love that rule. I love how that, I love laws. Man, seeing 40 miles an hour on Hilltop Road, I'm so excited to only drive 40. I didn't want to drive 41. I only want to drive 40. Man, what a good law. Isn't it strange to extol and sing the praises of laws and rules? But that's exactly what is going on throughout the whole of this psalm. And you wonder how in the world or why in the world is it that the psalmist would do such? Look with me in verse 97. He starts by saying, how I love your instruction, or how I love your laws. Again, that sounds so bizarre. God, I love your rules. Man, these prohibitions are just excellent. Man, that top 10 list that you gave, wow, that is just amazing. Because all of that stuff, I love a good rule. It is my meditation all day long. I'm thinking in the back of my mind about the stuff that you have said. These are the goalposts, the boundaries that I must operate in between. Then verse 98, he says, your commands make me wiser than my enemies, for they're always with me. I have more insight than all my teachers, because your decrees are my meditation. I understand more than the elders, because I obey your precepts. I've kept my feet from every evil path to follow your word. I've not turned from your judgments, for you yourself have instructed me. How sweet your word is to my taste, sweeter than honey in my mouth. I gain understanding from your precepts, therefore I hate every false way. Just a moment ago, I asked you this question. Why is it that so many times we find ourselves violating the rules, the laws, the standards that God has given? And the reason is because so many times we want to do something different. When God says, you shall not do this, you shouldn't do this, so many times I want to do, or you want to do something very, very different. So how is it that we can address this problem? Well, I think it has to come from us changing our perspective about what it is that we think about, how it is that we feel about God's laws. And again, how is it, though, that we can feel positive about rules? That seems kind of strange. That seems so onerous. That seems so unnatural even, that we would love rules. But it would only come when we begin to see the benefit, or we begin to accentuate the positives. And when we get to a point, and think with me about this, if you get to the point where you are able to say about God's laws what the psalmist says, that I love them, what do you think that's going to do? It's going to lead you to pay attention to them. It's going to lead you to obey them. All right, so how do we get there? I believe, again, it comes from accentuating the positives. He starts by saying, I love your instruction. It's my meditation. It's what I'm thinking about throughout the course of the day. And then verse 97, he says, your commands make me wiser than my enemies. What's so positive? What's the benefit of God's laws? Well, God's laws enable you to deal with opposition in positive ways. God's laws enable me to deal with opposition in positive ways. I know this sounds like an absolutely scandalous, nearly impossible thought, but there are people in this world that do not like me. I don't understand it. There are people that are not rooting for me, that don't like me. It's just true. I don't get it. I like me. But what I just said about myself, I feel certain you could say that about yourself as well. There are people that are not rooting for you today. There are people that don't, if pressed, they would find it difficult because of the distaste they have towards you. They would find it difficult even to mouth the words to say something positive about you because they don't like you. Not only are they not your Facebook friend, not only are you not their Facebook friend, they may even say, yeah, I'd put that person in the enemy camp. Every one of us, even if the word enemy is not used, has people that are not rooting for us. And you can do your best in life to try to avoid them, to try to work around them, but you can't always do that. Regularly, you find yourself working in these environments, being in school in those environments, sometimes even being in church in those environments where there is someone that is not your friend, who at this particular point is your enemy. And circumstances necessitate sometimes you having to deal with them face to face. Even though try as you might seek to avoid a conversation or to avoid interaction, you cannot always do that. And every time you have to interact with them, it's as if you're coming to a crossroads. You're coming to a situation where there's a dilemma about how you're going to respond and deal with them. But notice what the psalmist says. He says in verse 98, your commands make me wiser than my enemies. So the people that are not rooting for me, the people that don't wish me well, the people that may be actively working against me, your rules, your statutes, your expectations have made me wiser than them. Well, if you're wiser than the enemy, what do you think is going to happen? Well, you're not going to work or operate in ways that effectively give them a victory. You're not going to be responding in ways that effectively give them more ammunition to use against you. What does this look like? Imagine the scenario where you have an encounter with someone, and maybe you'll have one tomorrow. Maybe there's one today that you will have with someone who would fall into this category in your life. They're not rooting for you. They're not your friend. They don't like you. And if there's anything, they would like to take you down a notch or two. They have nothing positive to say towards you. But that being said, there's a conversation that you're going to have. There's an encounter that you're going to have with them. And in that conversation, suppose they make a snide remark. Maybe it's a backhanded compliment, and you can tell, it's transparent. What they are seeking to do is to just kind of smack you with their words. Maybe it is that they are, in a backhanded compliment, kind of making a false or baseless allegation. And so at this point, you've got this enemy that you're dealing with, this one who is not your friend, this one who is actively working against you, and even to your face, they're taking shots at you. Well, based on what the psalmist says, that when we operate and pay attention to and we love God's laws, we pay attention to His rules, and His rules make us wiser than our enemies. And so, for example, in that scenario, though the temptation is to unload and just go crazy on them, you remember what God said in Proverbs 51, that a gentle answer turns away anger, but a harsh word stirs up wrath. And so you tell yourself, I'm not going to go there. What I would love to say, what's on the tip of my tongue, I am not going to say that. Though I would love to go both barrels back at them, I'm not going to do that. And by the very act of you responding in that way, a number of things can happen. First of all, you haven't added any more fuel to the fire. You have taken away the opportunity they otherwise would have had to say, can you believe what Michael said to me? Can you believe what Michael said about me? If I never say it, if I never say the harsh word, they can't ever use that against me. But it may be by you choosing not to use the harsh word, for you not responding with both barrels, that the one who has been, even for a lengthy period of time, who's effectively been your enemy, maybe as the days turn into weeks, they cease to be your enemy. Why? Because you're doing things how God said to do them. Now, bear in mind, that's not what I want to do. Instinctively, that's not what you want to do. When someone is maligning you, when someone is unjustly accusing you, when someone else is making baseless statements against you, what you want to do is to squash them like a bug, right? I mean, you want to go after them. You want to respond kind for kind. In fact, you want to maybe even, as George W. Bush used to say, go nuclear. You may want to do that. That's what you feel inside. And holding back that harsh tone, holding back that harsh word, that's not what you feel like doing. Well, what can ever get you to the point to do that? Well, where you are accentuating the positive. Where you say, you know what, this may not be what I feel like doing. This may not be what I want to do at this very moment, but I know this is what God has said. And by doing what God has said, it enables me to deal with opposition in positive ways. It enables me to deal with those who oppose me in ways that don't hurt me, in ways that don't challenge me, in ways that don't adversely affect me. That's a real positive of God's laws. But the psalmist continues in verse 99 where he says, God's laws give me more insight than all my teachers. So God's laws give me insight. The principle is, God's laws give me insight that others cannot provide. God's laws, His rules give me insight and perspective that I can't find anywhere else. I don't know if you have discovered this or not, and for the longest time I didn't, fully understand some of the benefit of YouTube. You would see people putting all kinds of stuff on there that'd be professionally done or amateur done videos, all sorts of stuff on there. I don't know if you're aware of this though, but YouTube is a treasure trove of informational videos. Like for example, I wanted to change the in-cabin air filter on my Accord years ago for the first time. Because if you go to the dealership, they want, $19,000 to change that filter. You can buy it at the parts store for like $15 or $12, whatever. It's cheap. But if you go pop the hood and start looking for your in-cabin air filter, you will search all day and you will not find it. And so I knew it did not require a rocket science degree to be able to change this thing, but I just didn't even know where it was, and wherever it was, I didn't know how to get to it. So I just typed in change in-cabin air filter on an 05 Accord, and why there are people who have done this, I don't know, but gazillions of people have made videos about how to do all kinds of stuff. And it turns out you take the stuff out of your glove box and you drop it down, and it's tucked behind the glove compartment. And it takes about 2 minutes to change. As long as it takes you to get the junk out of your glove box and put it back in is about how long it takes to change this. And so it's amazing the stuff that's out there that you can find. You want to know how to do anything. You can almost anything I've been able to think of that I wanted to learn how to do, I can go to YouTube and somebody knows how to do it. And somebody will teach you how to do this. Pay attention, though, to what the psalmist says. He says, I have more insight than all my teachers. The point is this. There are insights and perspectives that you can only gain that will exclusively come from your appreciation from, your value on, your exposure to God's laws that you cannot get anywhere else. You can't get them from YouTube. You can't get them from Wikipedia. You can't get them from anywhere on the internet. You can't get it from school. You can't get, whether public school, high school, master's degree, PhD work. You can't go to a class. You can't read a book. You can't go to a series of libraries. You can't go to a particular class where there's a specific teacher. You can't even come to Gate City under a specific teacher or under a specific preacher. There are some things that you can only learn, insights and perspectives that you will only experience when you get to the point you pay attention to God's laws. That's what the psalmist says. He says, your commands, not only do they make me wiser than my enemies, but they give me more insight than all my teachers. But he continues. He says, I understand more than the elders. I understand more than the elders. What he's trying to say there is that God's laws provide me perspective that age cannot explain. God's laws provide perspective that age cannot explain. There are a stack of things that you can learn by going to a class. There's tons of things that you can learn by reading some books. But there is not a class, there's not a book on everything. There's not a YouTube video about everything. In fact, those of you who are further along and further down the road than I am would say this. Yeah, there are absolutely some things that you only learn by living. Just the sheer experience of life serves as a teacher. And there's not a class on everything. There's not a book on everything. And just by living, you tend to pick up those lessons. Here's the problem. By the time you've picked up all those lessons, you die, right? And maybe you've even heard somebody say, I've been trying to figure out all my life how to do life, and about the time I figure it out, it's about time to check out. You've heard something along those lines. And the longer you live, the more true you understand that statement to be, that there is so much that you gain just because of the sheer experience of living. Whether it's with family relationships, work relationships, whether it's things in the church, whether it's things about friends or neighbors, all kinds of stuff that you only learn by virtue of sheer experience. But pay attention to what the psalmist says. He says, I understand more than the elders. And these are the elders not just because of position, but these are the elders because they are the elderly. And so you've got the psalmist, and we don't know how old he is at this point, but he's saying, I understand more than the elders. So there are people who are much further down the road, and by virtue of being on the road, they've seen a lot more. They've been on the road a long time, they've seen a lot more, they've learned a lot, they've picked up a lot. I haven't been down those roads yet, but he says, I understand more than they do. Why? Because God's laws provide perspective that cannot be explained by age. I've had people say this to me before, and I don't honestly mean it in a prideful way, because it's not like people are beating down my door to say this. But over the years, there have been a few times where somebody has said this to me: Michael, your wisdom is beyond your years. To which some of you are gagging, right? Anyway, so at some point along the way, there have been at least a couple of delusional people who have said to me, hey, you are wise beyond your years. How in the world could something like that be true of anyone? Well, based on what the psalmist says, I believe it comes from an understanding of, an appreciation for, and an adherence to God's rules. The standards that God has given, when we pay attention to them, they yield understanding, they yield perspective that you don't have to be 100 years old before you figure them out. You can be much earlier in life, much earlier in your walk, that just by discovering and paying attention to God's laws, there's stuff that you can figure out that you can't learn in the classroom, that you can't learn from a book, that you can't learn from another teacher. God's laws provide perspective that age cannot explain. The last benefit, though, that the psalmist describes is this: that God's laws keep me from winding up in bad places. God's laws keep me from winding up in bad places. This is the last point, but honestly, from my perspective, it's probably the most important. The psalmist says in verse 101, I have kept my feet from every evil path. I've kept my feet from every evil path. It's easy to miss it because it is a small word. It's just 4 letters, but it's the word path. Well, what is a path? Well, a path is a road, paved or otherwise. It's a way to get from here to there. It's a route. The psalmist says of God's laws that they have kept his feet from every evil path. All paths, all routes, all roads start somewhere, and by definition, they go somewhere. Again, this is not something that requires a degree in rocket science. In fact, you don't need advanced degrees in cartography and map making to understand this. You will never, ever get to the right place by choosing the wrong road. You will never get to the right place while choosing the wrong roads. On Tuesday, I'd gone to Charlotte. Caroline's dad was, in fact, he's still in the hospital, and it was a big doctor's visit that was coming up. Winds up from that, they had sent him to the hospital, and I went with them as they got him checked in, trying to get him settled into the hospital, and we came to Gate City, so came to Greensboro in 2010. From 1975 until 2010, apart from being in school, I was in Charlotte, and I knew and know the city well. And I had driven from the time I was 16 until the time I was 36 on Charlotte roads, and so I knew how to get anywhere and everywhere. I did wonder, though, after we left Charlotte, how long it would be before I would get kind of fuzzy about where some stuff was. If you've moved away from it, wherever you grew up, you might have experienced that as well. And maybe you wondered, well, will I forget? Will I forget? When will I forget? And so I have wondered that. And so far, up until recently, I've had no issues. Now, on Tuesday, I'd gone to the doctor's visit. We went to the hospital. They'd taken him to Carolina's Medical Center, which is near downtown. And it was, I don't know, around 7 o'clock or so when I was going to leave the hospital to head back home. And I get to the car, I get out of the parking deck, and I get on one of the streets in downtown Charlotte, and I've got a sign. I know I need to get on 277. That's the little loop that goes around downtown. But the signs are different than they used to be, and they say inner and outer now. So it's like, when did roads become belly buttons, right? So we got innies and outies, and I need to go this way. I know that, but I don't know. Is that inner, outer? I don't know. And so I get on the one that I think that I need to go on, and that puts me on a ramp, and very quickly I'm seeing signs that say Columbia. I don't know if you're aware of this. Columbia is further than Charlotte is from Greensboro. I don't want to go to Columbia. They've got a great zoo. I wouldn't mind going to Columbia. I just didn't want to go on Tuesday night. And so I am on this road, and if I stay on this road, it doesn't make any difference whether that's where I want to go or not. You know where it's going to take me? It's going to take me to Columbia. That's what I need to do. I need to get on a different road. Why? Because I never get to the right destination while being on the wrong road. The greatest benefit of God's law is this: it keeps us off the wrong roads. Here's the interesting thing about routes and destinations, interesting thing about roads and routes and paths. When you get on a road, when you get on a path, you don't see the destination, do you? Typically, it's much further down the way. I didn't see Columbia, right? So many times in life, with respect to the decisions that we make, we get on wrong roads, we get on wrong paths, and we don't know it. In fact, it's only after we arrive at the destination we say, how did I get here? How did I land here? It's because I took the wrong path. It's because I took the wrong road. The benefit of God's laws is that when we pay attention to them, that keeps us off of the wrong roads. And if we stay off the wrong roads, it keeps us from going to bad places, to bad destinations. Many people, in fact, everyone here today is on a path. Or you're probably on multiple paths in your life. And some of you are on paths that are leading to some bad places. Some of you may be on a path that right now is barreling towards infidelity or is barreling towards divorce. Some of you are on a path that is barreling towards the loss of reputation, the loss of character, the loss of credibility. Some of you are on paths that are leading you and barreling you towards bad health, maybe even to a shortened life. But you can't see that right now because you don't get on a path and see the destination when you get on it. Put all this back into this passage. God uses the psalmist to say that the Lord's rules, His laws are so good that they keep me from getting on wrong roads that lead to wrong destinations that become very bad places. Almost instinctively, we tend to put rules into a negative category, right? Laws, rules, they seem so onerous. They seem so taxing. They seem so burdensome. They seem so restrictive. They constrain. They limit. They seek to alter our choices. And many times they are at odds with what we really want to do. The Bible that you have in front of you this morning, I'm not going to discount it at all. It contains a stack of rules. In fact, some will even castigate it because they say it's just a book of rules. Now, I believe it's more than that, but it's a book with a ton of rules. And many view it so negatively because they don't want to do anything with God, the church, or Christianity because they view the Bible as being nothing more than a big old rule book. And rules stink. Who wants to be confined by them? Who wants to be stuck with rules? I'll answer it. The ones who want to successfully deal with opposition. The ones who want to gain insight that can't be taught by others. The ones who want to gain wisdom without having to experience 100 years worth of life. And those who want to be kept from winding up in bad places. Those are the people that that would want to pay attention to rules. The other thing I would say to you is this. When I was a kid, anytime we would play Monopoly, I always wanted to be the banker. You know why? Because I like cheating. It was always kind of a 1 for you, 2 for me kind of thing. 2 for you, 3 for me. And so I kind of became known for cheating. And I always kind of enjoyed when I was cheating and people didn't know about it. But what I didn't really like, though, is when others would cheat too. Then it's no fun. In fact, the game, let's just put this thing away. It's just kind of a waste of time. If we're not going to pay attention to the rules, there's no use. You know, it's interesting. Though we tend to, by nature, want to recoil against rules and say they're so restrictive, they're so constraining, they're so unpleasant. In the absence, it just kind of makes everything a mess. It makes everything all the more unpleasant. Candidly, are we not observing that in our culture these days? As more and more standards get erased, as more and more prohibitions cease to exist, it's getting to the point where absolutely things aren't funny anymore. There is great benefit in the rules. And I know it sounds tough, it sounds almost illogical for the psalmist to be able to say of and to the Lord and of and about God's rules, I love them. How in the world do you get to that point? Well, you begin to get to that point by accentuating the positives. And you see just how blessed and what great blessing comes from them. And the more you love them, what's going to happen? The more you will obey them. And the more you pay attention and the more you obey God's laws, what happens? The more intentionally Christian your life becomes. So, if you're here this morning as a follower of Jesus, here's the question for you, kind of the culminating over the past 7 messages. You say that you are a follower of Jesus. You profess, I am a follower of Jesus. Do you want your life to just occasionally give credence to that? Do you want it to be accidentally lived in Christian ways? Or do you want it to be done intentionally, consistently demonstrating, I'm with Him? Will you bow your heads with me? As I said a moment ago at the outset of the message, this whole violation of God's standards, that's where we screw up, all of us, ultimately, in this living in intentionally Christian ways. And a moment